All right, Improvisation Center is back again, this time with the FMT. Yep, this old single cab F-150 truck. Been a few minutes since we've messed with this thing, and what we're getting ready to do today is install a little cheap aftermarket multi-gauge digital gauge thingy. This is a little cheap thing off of eBay. You can also tell that it's made in China, of course, since all these weird little gadgets seem to come out of China. So anyway, this thing here is just going to be used because our stock gauges are not accurate or just otherwise not functioning correctly. So I want to be able to know what this engine is doing as far as oil pressure and temperature. But this little gauge here will do oil pressure, temperature. I believe it does voltage, and it has a connection for an aftermarket fuel sending unit if I wanted to install that on the fuel tank, which if I keep this little gauge on here, that might be a consideration. So this is pretty much a simple setup. The whole thing has a bunch of wiring. As you can see, you got your power line right here. I think this green line here is for our fuel gauge. Got a super long yellow wire here that terminates at this little temperature sensor right here. And then you got the oil pressure unit right here on a little triple conductor cable stretching all the way back up to our gauge thing right here too. So first thing I gotta do is mount this shit and string all these wires through the firewall, which luckily we have a good spot right by the steering column. Probably gonna end up having to zip tie a bunch of extra wire together after I do string everything through and route it neatly enough. So go ahead and get started with mounting this thing. One thing I will say though, looking at the bottom of this thing, you would say that you could just simply drive some screws through something and mount it to whatever, but we're not going to just drive screws through anything. I want to try to find a suitable enough spot to mount this thing where, again, if I do get rid of this thing or go to something else, I could take it back out without having any permanent damage done to anything. So I'm going to go inside, see where I can mount this thing at in a semi-permanent / temporary kind of way. So into the cab we go. Okay, the solution I came up with, pretty cheesy, pretty cheap, pretty temporary as intended, is zip ties. Simple little setup. I used a couple long zip ties to secure the gauge body via its base to the top of the steering column. Pretty decent spot for it, seeing as the rest of the gauges are right here at face level if I'm looking down at a slight angle. So appropriate spot for it. It could easily be removed if need be. I also tucked all the wires between the steering column and the dashboard here so they could go under there. I can get my power wires hooked up at some point underneath there, and the rest of our wires going outside the firewall are more than able to do so, and I can still further zip tie stuff to keep things nice and neat. So with all that set up, one other little zip tie I put on there is right there to just further secure the base to the zip tie that's holding it on the steering column, so this thing won't just pull out from under the zip tie. So like I said, super temporary, because I want to see if this thing is actually going to be a viable device to have on here, and if so, then maybe at some point in the future I might consider permanently hooking this up. But truth of the matter is, I'm probably going to go with something like an A-pillar setup right here with some dedicated gauges. This is just on here for me to monitor the engine while testing this thing out, and until I work my way up to getting an A-pillar gauge set up. So I'm going to go ahead and get these cables here routed through the firewall, find us a power spot to hook our power lines up to, and then head on back outside. All right, squeezed up under the dash here just to kind of give you a visual of what's going on here, if the camera would kind of sort of focus. But yeah, we got our wires right here from the gauge snaked around, and got the wires going out through the firewall right there. And see that little blue connector right here, get it over in a better spot. That's our little tap into a 12-volt switched power source right there to supply power to it, and our ground right there. So everything is all hooked up as far as power is concerned. Everything is neatened up. Let me get out from under here. And got the gauge right here. So far when I turn the key on, kind of hard to see it with the glare, but there's our gauge. It's lit up. Now, of course, because this is straight out of China, everything is in the metric system. You're in Celsius and whatever the fuck MPa is. I forgot that unit of measurement. But the main thing I'm looking at is we have a visual gauge to kind of give you an idea, like, okay, we're in the good zone or we're not. So even if you don't know metric units of measure, you can at least look at the gauge and say, okay, yeah, everything is where it needs to be. Of course, volts are volts regardless. But with that done in there, let me turn this off so no need to kill the battery. Just take a quick visual outside in the engine bay. And there's our bundle of spaghetti right there, snaked through the firewall. The oil pressure sensor that I have to replace is under there, and the temperature sensor is right there underneath the distributor. So we're gonna have to take those old sending units out and put the ones in there that came with our stuff, and then snake our wires around, make it all nice and neat and everything, and hook all that shit up. So that'll be next. We've got our temperature sensor right here, as stated before, tucked away behind the distributor. Able to get it off pretty easily with a 13mm wrench. Of course, we're going to get a little water out because, well, we never really drained the cooling system from the top down. But got that out. Got our other unit right here. Go ahead and screw that in real quick so we don't lose too much water. Hold this cable. So we don't twist it all up. Grab a wrench, tighten that down. Yep. These temperature sensors with the kit are 12mm. So now, got our temperature sensor in. Let's get this little cable here situated. Now, got to get down in there for the oil pressure sensor. Okay, our oil pressure sensor, the stock one, is located right in there, kind of right above the oil filter and next to our oil dipstick tube, so you can obviously see everything's in the damn way. So right now what I'm fixing to do is remove the oil filter so I can get some extra room. Worst case, I might have to take this bolt out and get our dipstick free enough to be able to move it some so I can get a socket on there. I'm thinking it's something like a 21 because a 19 wouldn't fit. So we're gonna go ahead and take this stuff loose and get back in there. Okay, I took the oil filter off and I disconnected the hanger for the dipstick to give me a little bit of extra space. And that oil sensor is actually a 27mm hex body. So yep, had to get an impact socket. The only thing that was big enough to fit, that's deep well. So I'll go ahead and get this sensor off and then screw our other sensor in place, which hopefully doesn't require such a large wrench or anything. So let me get this done. Okay, we got our old oil pressure sensor there. We got our new one right here. That's a 1/8 inch fitting. Took an adapter to get it back up to 1/4 inch to match up to the bung in the engine block. So we're ready to put this thing in and get to our wires next. So let's go ahead and get this thing in, get all the other junk buttoned back up, and get our wires situated. All right, we got our sensor screwed into place and snugged down. We got Teflon tape on the treads so it shouldn't leak. So now, with that done, before I put our oil filter back on, I will put the dipstick back in place, but I'll get the wires set up first and then get that oil sensor plugged up before I put our filter back on, just in case I need that room still. So, to the wires. Okay, we got everything hooked up. We got our wire routed from under there. I don't know if you can see this shit, but coming through the hole in the firewall where the steering shaft is, wire runs up along behind the brake booster and then down around through all this, out around here, zip tied of course, and then comes out here, zip tied to the fuel line, and then the different pigtails go to the different sensors. We got our oil sensor down there done, temperature sensor. We put everything else back together as well. So now we're really ready to start this thing up and see what kind of readings we get. So let's go ahead and do that. All right, we got our truck running, and as we could see, our alternator's apparently working because we're reading 13.5 volts. Our water temperature is creeping up. This is in the metric system, so it's Celsius instead of Fahrenheit. And it says we're at 49 degrees Celsius, but I'm looking more at the gauge, 50 degrees. We're kind of just at the point of being in the green zone right there. Now, the funny thing is, on our oil pressure, I'm not sure what MPA stands for. If anybody in the metric system is around, just give me a heads up and tell me what MPA stands for. I've known what bar is compared to PSI, but I'm not sure what MPA is. But again, we're looking at the gauge part here, and we're reading 0.8 MPA at idle. And let me see if I can get some of this dirt off of here. That red zone, we're like probably in that red zone right now. So our oil pressure is low for all intents and purposes, but this is an old engine, so the oil pressure is probably not going to be as high as it would be on a new engine or one with a high volume, high pressure oil pump. But this is at idle. If I race it, it goes up, which is obviously expected and is at least a good sign that our oil pump is doing its job. We're not getting any death rattles, so we at least know that everything is flowing through the engine. Even if it is at a light pressure, we are getting some oil volume here. But regardless of all that, we can also look at our temperature gauge. It's at 60 degrees Celsius. We're in the low green zone right now. I'm just letting it kind of warm up right now, but we can see that our little gauge is doing its job of reading the vitals of the engine as well as our voltage. So for all intents and purposes, this thing does work. Now, if you're wondering what the hell the beeping is about, it's because our fuel gauge is not hooked up. After doing a little research on this little thing is actually able to self-teach itself to adapt it to different sending units. So this thing will actually, according to the factory specs, it will work with different stock sending units. So that might be a thing that I'll mess with later on, where I go ahead and hook this thing up to the sending unit on this truck and see if I can get this thing set up to actually read off of it. That'll be pretty cool, because then I could take all our metering and put it into this little gauge versus our stock gauges here. But for all intents, all the other shit is working. Hell, this thing's probably beeping because it's saying I got low oil pressure. As long as it's at that 1.0 MPa, it's happy. It doesn't flash that number like it's saying danger, danger. As soon as it gets below 1.0, it starts flashing. But yeah, this little gauge here is doing what it's supposed to do. So for all intents and purposes, I could say this gauge it's a success. We still need to do our fuel gauge though, so that'll be later on. So I might do a little quick update video on that whenever I do get that thing going. So stay tuned for that. But for all intents and purposes, our gauge is working. So as usual, hit the like button, subscribe, notifications, positive comments, stuff like that. Everything positive is always a good thing. So I'm gonna go ahead and shut this thing down and get inside, because it's still hot out here and it's summertime. It's hot as hell out here. So I shall catch you later. Appreciate the patronage and stay tuned for more. I'm in, out, in, yeah. Bye.